Really, every relationship he's ever had exists inside a power gap, so enormous that normal social dynamics, reciprocity, vulnerability, needing someone, never had room to develop. You can't lean on people the way most of us do when you are, by a wide margin, the strongest person in every room you've ever stood in. And this is where the character gets genuinely tragic if you're paying attention instead of just enjoying the fight choreography. Gojo's entire personality, the jokes, the teasing, the refusal to take almost anything seriously, reads a lot less like confidence and a lot more like a defense mechanism once you notice how carefully he avoids real emotional exposure. He deflects with humor constantly. He treats his own trauma, and there's a lot of it, as something to joke past rather than sit with. When Riko Amanai, a girl he was assigned to protect as a teenager, dies despite his efforts, despite being the strongest person there, the show gives him exactly one quiet, devastating moment of grief, and then never really lets him process it on screen again. He just continues, gets stronger, gets funnier, builds the wall a little higher. This is the part that gets flattened into, he's just confident, by most of the fandom, and I think it's worth being specific about why that reading misses something important. Confidence, the healthy version, usually comes from having tested your limits and found people who stick around when you fail. Gojo doesn't really have that second part. He doesn't fail. He's not allowed to, structurally. The plot needs him to be the ceiling everyone else is trying to reach, which means he almost never gets to be vulnerable in front of people as an equal. Even his closest relationship, with Geto, ends in the worst possible way. Geto, his one real peer, the only person who ever truly understood what it was like to carry that kind of power, becomes disillusioned with humanity and eventually has to be killed by Gojo himself. Read Why You Shouldn't Try to Be Gojo Satoru. There's a scene where Gojo Satoru is standing over a battlefield, blindfold off, completely unbothered, cracking a joke while people around him are either dead or terrified, and it's supposed to read as the coolest moment in the entire series. And it is cool. That's not the problem. The problem is what that coolness is actually built out of, and almost nobody watching stops to ask the question, because the swagger is so convincing you forget to check what's underneath it. You already know Gojo, strongest sorcerer alive, arguably the strongest character to ever exist in the setting, blue eyes, white hair, a personality that oscillates between chaotic older brother and guy who genuinely cannot be touched, physically or emotionally. He's become the internet's favorite blueprint for confidence, the meme template for I'm just built different, the guy people quote when they want to sound unbothered. And on the surface, sure, he's got a lot going for him. Limitless technique. 6 eyes. A body that literally cannot be damaged the normal way. If you wanted to pick one character from modern anime to represent having it all, you'd pick him. But here's the thing the show is actually telling you, quietly, in almost every scene that isn't a fight. Being the strongest didn't make Gojo happy. It made him alone. And the story is remarkably consistent about drawing a straight line between those two facts, even while it's busy making him the coolest person in every room he walks into. Let's go back to where this starts, because it matters. Gojo was recognized as a prodigy from birth, essentially, born into a sorcerer family with a bloodline destined to produce someone exactly like him, and by the time he's a teenager, he's already surpassing sorcerers who've trained for decades. That sounds like a flex, and the show frames it that way in the moment, but sit with what that actually means developmentally. He never had peers. Not that again. The one person capable of actually relating to him ends up on the wrong side of a blade Gojo has to swing. After that, watch what happens to him. He gets more powerful, sure. He becomes a teacher, which on paper looks like growth, mentoring the next generation, building relationships with Yuji, Megumi, Nobara. But notice the shape of those relationships. He's still, structurally, unreachable. He's the strongest person any of them have ever met, which means even his students relate to him more like a force of nature than a person. He jokes with them, he cares about them clearly, but he almost never lets them see him struggle, because there's very little he actually struggles with in a way that would let them reciprocate care. Caring for Gojo is mostly a one-way street, and the story seems to know this, because it keeps circling back to how isolating that actually is for him, even while he's surrounded by people who love him. There's a very telling line, actually, where Gojo essentially says that being the strongest is lonely, not as a boast, but almost as an aside, like it's just a fact of his existence he's stopped being surprised by. That's the whole character in one sentence. Extraordinary capability, purchased at the cost of ever really being known by anyone as an equal. And here's where I want to push back on the just be confident like Gojo reading a little harder, because I think people mistake his detachment for security when it's actually closer to a survival strategy for someone who was never allowed the luxury of being ordinary. Think about what his humor is actually doing in almost every scene. It's rarely just a joke, it's a pressure release valve, a way to keep every conversation light enough that nobody, including him, has to sit in how heavy his actual situation is. He's responsible, functionally, for holding back an entire world's worth of curses because almost nobody else can. That's not a fun weight to carry. But instead of the strongest person alive didn't save someone he was responsible for, it gives him a single quiet scene, and then the narrative essentially fast-forwards years. And when we see him again, he's already hardened into the version of himself everyone recognizes. Funnier, flashier, more detached. That transition happens almost entirely off-page, which is its own kind of statement. We don't get to see him work through it, because, in-universe, he probably didn't either. He just built a better mask. This matters because it establishes the actual mechanism of his personality, not just the symptom. It's not that Gojo is naturally aloof. It's that the one time his failure had real consequences, nobody was equipped to help him carry it, so he taught himself to carry everything alone from that point forward, and got extremely good at making that look effortless. Effortlessness, in his case, isn't the absence of struggle, it's struggle that's been driven so far underground that even the person experiencing it stops noticing it's there. I'll put that next to Guido, because their friendship is really the emotional core of the character, and it's worth examining exactly what breaks it. Guido isn't a stronger fighter than Gojo, not close, but he's the one person capable of relating to Gojo as an equal in every way that matters, someone who understands what it's like to be feared and needed at the same time, to be a tool the world relies on, while also being lonely inside that role. When Guido starts to lose faith in humanity, disturbed by how non-sorcerers treat sorcerers, disturbed by the cruelty he witnesses, Gojo's response isn't really engagement. He doesn't talk him down, doesn't sit with him in the disillusionment, doesn't offer the kind of raw vulnerability that might actually reach someone spiraling that badly. He mostly just continues being Gojo. Confident. A little removed. And Guido drifts and drifts until the drift becomes irreversible. I don't think the story is. Impression of confidence, sitting on top of someone who's never actually been allowed to be uncertain in front of another person. And the cost of that impression is exactly what the show shows you with Gojo. Brilliant relationships that never quite become mutual, humor that substitutes for honesty, and an ending where the strongest person in the story dies the way he lived, capable of anything except letting someone else share the weight. If there's a version of Gojo worth taking something from, it's not the swagger. It's the brief, rare moments where the mask slips, when he talks about Rico, when he stands over Guido's body, when that one line about loneliness slips out almost by accident. Those moments are the truth of the character. Everything else is a very good performance of a man who was never given the chance to need anyone. So the next time someone tells you to be unbothered like Gojo, maybe ask them which version they mean. The joking, effortless one everyone loves, or the one standing alone at the end of the story, exactly the way he was standing alone at the beginning of it, having never once let anyone catch him. Because those are the same person, and that's exactly the point. Let's slow down on the Rico Amanai arc for a second, because I think it's the single most revealing sequence in the entire early story, and it rarely gets talked about outside of, that's when Gojo got serious. He's assigned, as a teenager, to protect a girl who's about to be used as a vessel for a merger ritual, and despite being wildly overpowered for basically every threat in his path, he fails. She dies. Not because he wasn't strong enough. He's the strongest person in the scene by an absurd margin, but because the threat comes from a direction his strength genuinely couldn't have anticipated. And what's fascinating is what the story does with that failure. It doesn't give Gojo a grief arc. It doesn't give him a support system that helps him process the fact that being show letting him talk about that weight directly, he almost always converts it into a bit, a joke, a moment of theater. And audiences love him for it. Understandably, it's genuinely charming writing, but charm here is doing a lot of work to disguise a person who has never been given the chance to just be scared, or tired, or unsure, out loud, in front of someone. Compare this to how he actually dies, because I think it's the most important piece of evidence in this whole argument. Gojo doesn't die surrounded by people who catch him. He dies in a sealed, isolated fight against Sukuna, cut off from backup, alone in the exact way his entire life has trained him to be. Even in death, the narrative keeps him in the pattern it's been building the whole time. The strongest person, by himself, facing the hardest thing alone, because nobody else could possibly stand there with him. It's not framed as tragic in a loud way. There's no dramatic monologue about loneliness, but structurally, it's the same shape his entire life has taken. Extraordinary. Isolated. Unreachable, right up to the end. So why does any of this matter if you're not, again, a limitless sorcerer fighting curses? Because the pattern underneath Gojo is genuinely common, especially among people who get identified early as the talented one, the gifted kid, the one who's just built different. When you're recognized young as exceptional, you often get isolated from ordinary struggle in ways that look like a gift and function like a wall. People stop offering you help because they assume you don't need it. People stop relating to you as an equal because the gap feels too wide. And you learn, the way Gojo clearly has, to perform ease instead of admitting difficulty, because admitting difficulty when you're supposed to be the strongest one in the room feels like a kind of failure nobody's given you permission to have. The habit that gets built from that isn't confidence. It's a very convincing. Blaming Gojo for Guido's fall. That would be too simple, and Guido's choices are his own. But it is quietly showing you that Gojo's specific brand of emotional unavailability has a cost that isn't limited to himself. The people closest to him don't get access to the parts of him that might actually need connection, which means even his deepest friendship ends up operating on the surface for the moments that mattered most. And when Gojo is eventually forced to kill Guido, years later, the show frames it with an unbearable calm that isn't peace. It's the same detachment that's been protecting him his whole life, now being used to survive the worst thing that's ever happened to him. There's also something worth noting about how Gojo relates to his own body and his own limits, because it mirrors the emotional pattern almost exactly. He is, physically, close to untouchable. 6 eyes plus limitless makes him borderline impossible to actually hit under normal circumstances. And you'd think that would make him careless, but it's more specific than that. It makes him someone who has never had to build the muscle of asking for backup, because backup has never functionally mattered. Watch how he enters most fights. Alone, confident, often explicitly telling others to stay back because he's got it. Sometimes that's genuinely true. But it's also a habit, and habits formed under one set of conditions don't magically adjust when the conditions change. When he finally does end up in a fight, he can't simply win through overwhelming force, sealed away from backup, facing Sukuna at close to full strength. The exact instinct that made him legendary is the same instinct that leaves him with nobody beside him when it matters most. This is the part I think is genuinely worth sitting with if you're someone who admires him. The show isn't punishing Gojo for being strong. It's showing you, patiently, across the entire runtime, that unprocessed exceptionalism doesn't disappear just because nobody ever calls it out. It just gets rebranded as personality, as swagger, as that's just how he is. And because he's charming and hilarious, and genuinely good to the people around him in 100 small ways, it's easy to miss that the charm is doing structural work, keeping every relationship at a depth shallow enough that his own unprocessed grief, his own loneliness, never has to surface where anyone could actually help him with it. Compare this briefly to Yuji, one of his students, who gets put through his own set of horrors but is at least surrounded by peers who are explicitly on his level. Megumi, Nobara, people who can genuinely share the weight because they're not separated from him by an unbridgeable power gap. Gojo never had that. Not as a student, not as a teacher, not really even as a friend to Guido once the gap in worldview opened up. Every relationship in his life exists slightly out of reach, and the show's quiet tragedy is that he built an entire personality optimized for making that distance charming instead of addressing it. So if you're drawn to Gojo, and it's easy to be, he's magnetic, he's funny, he's the person everyone wants at the party, separate the performance from the actual architecture underneath it. The performance is confidence. The architecture is a person who was never allowed to be ordinary, who lost the one friend capable of meeting him as an equal, and who dies the exact way his entire personality was quietly built to guarantee. Brilliant, untouchable, and completely alone. That's not a flex. That's the cost of never letting anyone see the version of you that isn't winning.